So when we're ready to go, I click this one, click the internet chat. So we're not ready. Does it know that?
Where'd she go?
I don't know.
Leslie!
It's 8:01. 45 seconds.
Take your seat, what's going on? Picture's fine?
It's good. You're halfway in the camera when you're leaning over like that, but when you go back to the chair, you'll be fine.
Yeah, we should come. Let's just start it. Look good?
Screen was still doing it. I was like, no. Yeah.
All right, everybody, welcome to philosophylive.com, Sunday night at 8 p.m. Tonight's show is going to be about evidence. We're going to be talking about Christian slash religious perspectives versus atheist perspectives. And we're going to be talking about evidence from a philosophically epistemological standpoint, which I will discuss. On tonight's show, we've got our normal co-hosts, Leslie. We have Kara on the administrative tasks, and with the Muppet input. We have special guest who's not that special because he's always here, Craig Dyer. We have a special guest tonight is what?
It's okay.
Special guest tonight is Doug Harrison, who is the interim professor at Episcopalian Theological Seminary of the Southwest, and me, your host, Jim Salek. Before we start, I'd like to say you can watch us anytime on philosophylive.com. You can link from Stickum or from our website. Starting tonight, at least for tonight, we're broadcasting live on 100.1 FM KSAR, the Sovereign American Radio, Austin, Texas, Lake Travis. So if you're in the Austin area, Lake Travis area, or any surrounding areas, you can try to pick it up on 100.1. You can also view it anytime on the internet at philosophylive.com, and we will have archived files of the show. So tonight's show is going to be about evidence, and we are going to try to stay on topic, unlike most of the times. If we have a topic breakdown halfway through, that will probably be to your advantage, and we'll see what happens. We are getting absolutely no audio. All that was wasted. None. Zero.
Do I need to push anything on this? It's recording.
No, we'll just fiddle with it like we always do.
We'd really like somebody to actually know how to do this.
We're getting audio, we're just not getting a lot. So let us know in the chat room when you guys start coming in if you start to have some kind of audio problems.
It's working.
What did it just jump up?
It's working.
I would like to also invite the aliens and the demons into the room that are constantly ever present in my laptop. And we may have audio problems in and out. As you know, last time we had a phone go haywire and kill 3 people. So what I'm going to start with today is talking about epistemology. I'm going to define that. I'm going to define what it even means to have evidence. And we're going to go from there into a more religious discussion. At any time, you guys can ask questions in chat. We ask that you put the questions in red. And the administrator will ask us the questions if they're not totally insane. Actually, they probably have to be pretty good. And you can also request to be called. We're not accepting phone calls tonight the way we normally do. We'll be happy to call you. Just ask your question, say that you want to be live on the phone, and during the times when we can do that, we'll let you call in and we'll put you live on the air if you're not an insane person. Or if you're an insane person and you've been on Howard Stern. So the first thing I'm going to do is, for those of you who don't know what epistemology means, it's the branch of philosophy that's called the study of theories of knowledge, which means, how do I know what I know? Oftentimes people act like they know what they know without any kind of, I don't want to say evidence, but any kind of rational approach to backing it up. So epistemology is the question in response to that. How do you know what you know? How are you confident in what you know? And especially when people say, I'm 100% sure of what I know, how sure are we that they know that? So epistemology is the branch of philosophy, the fundamental area of questioning that addresses this. Evidence in particular is a reasoning method. It's a way of saying, I'm persuading you to believe in my case. I'm supplying these premises, and I want to convince you through this set of evidences or reasons in order to build to a conclusion. Of course, it's not that formal. But the first thing I'd like to address is the fact that people seem to ignore the process or deny the process of evidence as they're doing it. And so what we ask, especially if you're asking questions and especially if you're considering our questions, that you understand our position, which is that almost everything people do rings of evidence or of an evidential method, whether good or bad. When people are trying to make an argument, what they do is, especially in a social setting, most communication, obviously, unless you're talking to your own personalities, will be this engagement with other people. And in order to persuade them, in almost every realm, from the superficial all the way to the epistemological, is going to contain some form of evidence, whether you know it or not. And what people naturally do is provide this evidence, persuade with evidence, supply evidence for every kind of argument there is. And tonight's show is about religion. It's about specific questions related to religion and to God. So if I'm trying to persuade someone that I believe in God, or I'm trying to persuade someone that I don't have belief in a God, or I'm trying to persuade someone that there is no God, the position is going to be mostly banal or useless or moot if you don't provide some kind of structured reasoning method, specifically some kind of evidence for your belief, whether that be physical evidence or rational evidence, or something else, because our question is going to be, what do these different types of evidence mean, how profound are they, and how persuasive are they? And we're going to have, hopefully, different perspectives on this. What I wanted to note ahead of time, you can jump in anytime if you want. Am I convincing you? So far? So what I wanted to first talk about is basic religious arguments, what they call the classical trio of religious arguments, because I'm doing it, one, because they're funny, two, because I'm interested in them, and three, because we don't want a whole bunch of people coming on and arguing what I would call blindly about them. The arguments fall into the categories of teleological, cosmological, and ontological. And these are the arguments that Immanuel Kant actually tackled as a Christian and said these arguments, in a lot of ways, provide too much evidence, attempt to provide too much evidence, because what Kant was saying was, in a lot of ways, evidence gets in the way of faith. So, in a sense, Kant's preserving some kind of domain for faith where the evidential perspective, or what we would now call a scientific perspective, doesn't set the rules, perhaps. The teleological argument is argument by design. I see things in the world designed. Who the hell designed them? The cosmological is first cause. What was the first thing that started this? If all of this is a sequence of events, a sequence of events, however you see them, evolutionary or by intelligent design or whatever, what was the initial cause, and how do we conceive of some sort of initial cause? And certainly the Christian perspective is that it makes sense to insert a God in that place. The ontological being the argument in the sense that the ontological was put forth by a couple people and then mastered by Descartes, in the sense that you can master a ridiculous argument. But my exposure to the ontological, and I have to say, of all the arguments, the ontological is actually the most academic, and it has books and books written about it as if you can take it seriously, and I'm having a hard time taking it seriously even right now. But what Descartes said was that if I can imagine a perfect being in my head, and I truly believe in what perfect means, for God not to exist denies the perfection, which means if he is as perfect as I conceive him, one of the elements of perfection must be the reality of him, must be his existence. And the other take on that ontologically is that if we have this perfect image in our head and we are not perfect, which I think, except for me, I would agree that people aren't perfect. So, and what Descartes is saying is all people understand this. So if I have a perfect idea of God in my head, who put it there? So those are really basic. And what you're going to find is, especially tonight probably, not a lot of sympathy on either side from Doug or from Craig about simple interpretations of these three arguments. You probably drop the ontological because none of us speak that language, but with teleological and design, especially if anyone knows anything about Ray Comfort and his reliance on the design argument in all its various forms, especially the Watch in the Desert disaster, you find that it doesn't help either side. It does rely on evidence, but it asks for fallacies in order to be in any way designed. Teleological argument states there's a bunch of design in the world. we have to subscribe a designer to that in the same way we would subscribe a designer to a watch we found in the desert, a Coke can that we found sitting in our street. But the problem being that this is a circular argument to begin with, first of all, because the question really inherently contained this particular doubt, and this particular sense of wonder. We're talking about the natural world when we talk about who designed the world and us, and we don't know the answer to that. So until you answer that, you can't continue on with the teleological argument. So you can't say because I found a watch and I can, from that, make up my mind that a man designed it by putting parts together in order to make it function properly. You can't compare that process to a process we don't have a designer for if the question in the beginning was one side saying we have a designer and the other one saying no, prove it. So you can't make an argument by design if you're going to continue with the argument as such, which is one person saying, I have an argument for why you should believe in this God. The proof is there's a God. So what we're asking you to do is prove who designed natural things, not restate your initial argument. But, and I hope you understand that, but if you don't, what I'd like to say is that for me, the actual problem with that argument actually relates to something completely different, which is in a sense, what the teleological argument would tell us if we believed it. Because honestly, I don't believe in much from the faith-based community. I don't believe in much from much divine knowledge from my experience or the people's experiences that I've talked to. But I will say, and maybe everyone should be sitting for this, but I will say that the argument by design does persuade me to some extent, regardless of all these attempts that non-believers make, some of which are really good, Sigmund Freud being one of the best, and Bertrand Russell, obviously, if you know this. But I wouldn't say the tree is there at a certain height, and my air is a certain mixture. I don't believe that. I believe that came first and we came second. So I would say teleologically, you want to approach it from a moral standpoint, or you want to approach it from a coincidence standpoint. Where do these coincidences come from that actually seem designed? But my point is that even if I feel there are aliens controlling this planet, my point is that if you make a successful teleological argument to your opponent and then posit a Christian God, you've made a leap farther than Kierkegaard on his worst day, because saying that something designed this says nothing about the designer other than leading you into the problem of evil. But I'll leave this alone, except I'll make the argument you're going to sound really retarded. Cosmological is first cause. We all know Bertrand Russell had no problem with this one, because anything that states a first cause and accepts that as a principle would then have to have a first cause for God. And again, it's a circular argument when you say, well, it stops at God, because then you've chosen to change your starting point again in order to win your argument rather than to explore the question, which was, does a thing ever have a first cause? And again, more importantly for me, the cosmological argument doesn't posit what it would be. Yes, if you can prove there's a first cause, which you can't, it seems arbitrary to then say your God with all its characteristics is that thing. I mean, that's not even part of the argument as it's presented in cosmological. So I'm going to be done with that stuff. You're welcome to discuss those in some complexity, but I would encourage you not to ramble about them any more than I just did. So the last thing I want to say is about the atheist perspective, and then I'm going to bring Craig on to talk about it. But what we don't find a lot of universality in atheist perspectives, and it's certainly such a growing movement right now. There are diverse perspectives. But one thing we find in common is kind of a materialist value perspective. I think the atheists seem to agree that materialism is a kind of worldview that makes sense to them. What we gather through our senses supplies us with the real information, and from that kind of processing, we can make real decisions about our lives. Based on this is our simple, almost Randian conceptions of the real world, the objective world. This world holds our value and the source of our actions. And that's important to an atheist, and a lot of times that's going to be the perspective from which he comes in order to address a Christian, if they are going to even have a reasonable discussion, which is pretty unlikely. So what I'd like to do now is ask Leslie if she's lost her faith in the past 5 minutes.
Faith?
Do you have any faith?
No, I wouldn't say I have faith.
You just
I
have
believe.
You have belief. Do you want to add anything to my little thing, or you just can't wait to hear what Craig's got to say?
I understand Craig better, actually.
Than me?
Yes.
What do you mean you understand Craig better than me?
Yeah, we speak more of the same language about things.
The
Did I just
epistemological
say that?
framework.
I'm serious.
You say you
It
speak the
happens.
same language as Craig and
I
not the
feel
same
like-
language as me.
Well, I feel like I can talk to Craig more because you just like.
This is where the show gets
Maybe I should stop talking to you then.
I'm just saying.
I mean, all the energy I put into you is a waste of time.
No, it's not.
So what you're saying is you like Craig better.
I'm just saying. I think
Do
we
you want him to
have
sit on your
more
lap?
of the same perspectives on things, so I can understand what he says.
Probably a little too big for
more,
that.
Because I don't know, you use like all of these just like real rigid terms for things and stuff, and so it kind of loses me.
Does it lose you or do you disagree with them? There's a difference.
No, it just loses me because it's all very structured and
Academic?
yeah, academic. That's perfect.
Wouldn't want any structure or any kind of organized,
I'm just saying.
reasonable.
Maybe I'll learn to relate to it one day, but
Can I bribe you in any way? Like give you money to agree with me? I
I'm
felt
not
that every.
disagreeing with you.
Can I just
I'm
make one statement though? Like every good-looking girl I've ever met disagrees with me fundamentally, even if they don't. Like that's their goal. Their goal is to, you know what? For a minute I agreed with them, but I'm too good-looking too.
I don't think that I'm.
You don't like that either. You didn't. That lost you too. Like you're mad about that.
I'm
Go
not
ahead.
disagreeing with you.
Okay.
I just don't understand all the. But then again, you're just kind of like throwing these ideas that aren't really yours, right? So it's not really disagreeing or agreeing with you.
I'm like Fox News. I'm purely. I'm purely fair and balanced. I'm presenting both sides. I don't have any beliefs. I don't even have a backbone. If you looked in my back, you would find nothing. You know, but you don't care to. You like Craig better. You want to play with his backbone?
Shut up.
It just makes me mad. I like your hat, by the way. She just bought this new hat. I really like it. I mean, I liked it until now. Do you want to talk about the rigid thing anymore? The
I'm
rigid.
mad.
I'm mad. I put a lot of energy
No,
into your
it's-
creation.
Well,
I designed her on the
I
computer.
just want
I will
Losing
admit that.
viewers.
Huh?
Losing viewers.
Oh.
see, as soon as I start talking.
No, they're
as long as
saying.
I'm just sitting here.
I love that
it's
it was what
fine.
you were saying,
As soon as I
including
start
them.
talking, everybody just disappears. Like,
It's not
okay,
that. She's
I'm
saying that
talking.
I've gotten off topic, is what she's basically saying. But see, look at her shaking her head. Okay, but we'll bring on Craig, and we're going to talk more about the evidence and the religious stuff, and then you can yell at us from the microphone.
Okay.
Welcome, Craig.
Hi, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
It's so rare to have you on the show.
I know. It's my second time, I think, maybe. So, but we'll see
Second
if it happens
punnery
again.
time?
If I haven't been totally excommunicated from this whole procedure now due to jealousy.
Dude, I can't even. I
Other
mean,
appearance.
my heart getting broken this many times has made me so kind of unnerved with the whole thing. Like, my heart getting broken is like Austin not fixing Howard Lane or something. It's just, there they go again.
I know. You're a big target, and I feel bad for you, really.
I do think I'm a target, but so let's talk about first maybe the atheist perspective. I mean, I know I spit it out there, maybe elaborate on it, or
Well, I think that relative to the night's discussion, I think what you touched upon that's most relevant is this idea that there is a sort of this basis of evidence that the atheist generally stems toward is what a lot of us probably call, the scientific method, is this idea that what is repeatable, through our anticipation, we validate our perspective on things, and I would say that most atheists, as Jim would agree, I think, tend to be very materialist about things. They tend to think that thought is a product of matter, as opposed to matter being a product of thought. And that really sets up this whole, I think, we were saying that atheists, right? We were saying that atheists, generally speaking, think that thought is a product of matter, not matter a product of thought, right?
I had a flashback to Leslie.
No, that's totally what you said. No, remember that the atheist is one who, generally speaking, doesn't like to assume or take confidence in the things that are beyond what is the most certifiable. And I think that's more or less the atheist perspective. There is that they think there's an absence, right, of justification for some of the things that theists would posit are possible occurrences. Now there are a little bit more, and I think it's an important distinction here, though, is that when we consider both the theists and the non-theists, I think that some atheists are going to be those people who are going to require a sort of exhaustive explanation for things in order to accept them, whereas other atheists may even just challenge, will only challenge what's incoherent. And I think that's what we're going to see later on when Doug comes on, and he's going to talk about this notion of the scientific method and anticipation being the proper way to explore these questions that, as you spoke about in the beginning, really kind of defy our very notion of logic and sequence when you spoke about the cosmological argument. You know,
It's my favorite one.
when each of us tries to think about, well, how did we get here? You know, we think about, you know, the various things that led us to this step. But as you speak about the cosmological argument, it comes down to the infinite regress of the unmoved mover. This idea of this, you know, eternal precedent, something preceded it or something did
That's
not.
why she likes you better. Your words are better than mine. The phrases.
I think that's what she was
They
saying.
kind of
Yeah,
are.
she just said.
I'm much better looking,
excessive.
honestly. I would think.
Feel free to text in, viewers, and vote.
Hey, that's not a bad idea. Which
But,
one's better looking?
But I think, and again, I think this is going to be Doug's forte later on this evening, is to sort of explain to us how that perspective may not be sufficient to answer some of these theological questions. That much as the sequence that our minds seem incapable of escaping as we make sense of the present relative to the past, we see no other alternative for that, but at the same time, we don't have an answer for it. So sometimes atheists take their strength from that, and sometimes I think theists can take their
So what
strength.
you're saying is you guys are going to relativize me to death. I'm going to drown myself in the fish tank again, like that girl you brought on last time that made me kill myself, and I had to get resurrected 3 days later to come on the show.
All
You
those
guys going
things
to
that
relativize
happen.
me to sell me?
No embellishment. Well, I mean, I do think that Doug and I have a similar perspective in that theists and atheists seek to answer the same question. And that maybe there isn't quite as big of a division between these two perspectives as one would initially think.
But one believes in a God and one doesn't.
Well,
This is
yes,
a big division to me in a planet that kind of bases
Well, but-
the idea of God.
but it's not atheism, it's atheism, and that's what we speak about. I think, you know, how literally are we going to take things, right? You know, how literally are we going to interpret whatever text or whatever guidelines lead us to things, and how much is theism instead a product of unpopular answers as far as the scientific community is to questions that the scientific community hasn't even answered yet. So I don't mean to relativize everything. I mean, I think that that's why
I don't mean to do it. Well, that's the thing. I don't mean to relativize it. I'm about to do it.
Well, I think that the only hard distinction you make is this, is that there are people who are going to reject any and all things which cannot be certified 100%. If you can't prove
You
exhaustively...
mean normal people, people with a brain in their head.
Well, I definitely would not use those descriptions because, again, who's omniscient, right? I mean, are atheists omniscient? Are scientists? Is anybody except for Jim Saul omniscient? Does anybody except for Jim Saul claim to know everything? Well, if you don't claim to know everything...
wait.
claim to know
Ayn Rand would say that we're all omniscient. And you know, I don't even need to talk ever again because luckily Ayn Rand came along, but I think her position would be, and she can't do it right now because you guys killed her with your relativism, gave her a heart attack. I mean, Nietzsche caught syphilis, that's why he died, but yeah, that's what it was. And Ayn Rand, it was really more the relativism, just burned out her liver. And my liver hurts right now listening to you, but my point is that if she was here, she would say everyone is omniscient in that sense because the world is material and we all have knowledge of everything that there is in this world, and that's the materialist perspective. And I think
Well, I see what you're
you
saying.
certainly can't ignore that perspective. I mean,
Well, I think that you're right that there is a sort of immediate paradigm to our experience as human beings, but I think that same paradigm leads us to a big dead end in a very obvious and necessary question, which is that question of sequence that we spoke about. Again, how did we arrive here? And that always boils down to the infinite regress and the unmoved mover. We know from this same immediacy that the present is happening, it is occurring, but our very system of sequence and our very system of material validation seems completely incapable of answering that. So, to a certain extent, I think that we have to recognize that ignorance, that an objectivist, be they Ayn Rand or not, would have to say, my knowledge is incomplete.
right. Well, I mean, you guys are going to talk more about this, about the two perspectives and the
similarities.
incompatibility of the kind of language used. But I certainly think that even though I've already said I'm somewhat persuaded by the teleological in the sense that I believe that there's mysteries, is basically what I'm saying. So, of course, I'm contradicting myself as I always do. But I would say that there's a lot of, I mean, I take seriously that strict materialist perspective in the sense that when we consider what truth is, if we want to really talk about what it means, and especially in terms of what we're going to do with our lives, our actions rather than our hypothetical pot ramblings, I think that when we talk about our life, I'm not saying anything about anyone in particular, I'm just saying I need to smoke more pot, but what I'm saying is that the materialist perspective, as it is strictly, in the sense that we're all omniscient, in the sense that our senses do take in everything we need to, and we don't need to go any further than that. That perspective does seem to lend a great amount of meaning to our lives. I think if we separate it from Christianity, if we don't try to synthesize it with Christianity, you know, and I think I'm speaking, I wouldn't call myself an atheist, but I would say that a lot of complex atheists have that kind of perspective. They say the Christian perspective actually offers some kind of illusory state that can be added on to a materialist perspective, and in a sense, make it disingenuous.
Well, I think I know what you're
That's
saying.
just a good word that means I'm right, because I don't even know what the hell I meant by that last sentence.
Well, I feel like what you're indicating is that there is perhaps an extra explanation tacked on something
an
you
Occam's
feel
razor.
like
It's an Occam's
is
razor.
unnecessary. You feel like there's a sort
Without Jodie
of
Foster.
immediate cogency, an immediate
I don't know what
understandability
cogency
to our.
No, seriously. No.
It means an immediate understandability to our environment, and I feel like what you're saying is, like you said, the Occam's razor is that there's no need to fill in these other blanks. And I guess I feel like I'm not entirely sure why you have that confidence because of the infinite regress, the unmoved mover. Neither of those things making sense. The necessity of sequence for explaining the president, particularly insofar as you believe that there is a past, present, and a future.
You know, I don't disagree
that
with
posits
you.
that
I don't
there is some sort of-
disagree with
there's
you.
a gap. See what I'm
I don't
saying? There's
disagree with you about the
ignorance.
gap. What you're specifically calling the gap is what I would call legitimate mystery. But here's my, I think the materialist problem is that we don't know if our senses can grasp that yet. There's no reason to rule out the possibility that it's just as material as everything else. And I clearly think that that's the educated atheist position, is that science is in no way, this is what Freud was saying, science is in no way finished. Science is in no
Right.
way a complete project. And if you are a scientist, I think what you find is that this is the nature of science, this kind of confidence from minor successes and the growth of successes, to the extent that we can start to say, I'm confident that my senses are going to someday be able to understand things in a better... I mean, I think the infinite regress is the last one we're going to get, but there's a lot of mysteries that I want to know about, like why Leslie likes you more than me. And what I want to do is address that mystery from this materialist perspective, expecting the kind of results I've been getting from it when my airplane doesn't crash, for instance, or my doctor doesn't misdiagnose me, which he always does, so maybe you're right, but you know what I'm saying.
Well, I think that you're right that ultimately everything is going to have a metaphysical explanation, and I think that it's, you know, I think that both religion and science do strive to answer that. I think you're quite right when you say that scientists don't say that we're omniscient. They don't claim to know everything. So there is this gap of knowledge, both from science and from this immediate perspective you refer to. And I think that as theologians, we can then, I guess it's like this, if through science, for example, if through anticipation we come with two equally probable explanations, this is kind of where I think faith comes in, and one can say, well, of these two equally probable explanations, I lean towards this one. That's the basis of my faith. And, you know, that doesn't seem so wholly irrational to me. That doesn't seem to smack of hypocrisy or incoherence. It seems as though one is positing a best guess for the ignorance that science admits to having. But when we run the problem, I think the great divide right now is just that there are people who have tried to answer questions that have come up in the past through religion that science has now provided a different answer for. People have more confidence in science on these particular questions than they do in the religion, and certain religious people are like saying, no, I don't want to believe that. Like, for example, the duration of the earth. I think it's a sort of common notion that the biblical representation of the age of the earth is 6,000 years, whereas science is going to go ahead and point it out to 6 million years. And the basis of the evidence, right, is going to be a piece of paper that was, you know, supposedly written on by some dude many moons ago versus a repeatable text. Now, how relevant that is, though, to the explanation of all things, I think what Doug is going to touch upon quite eloquently, though, is that that's the sort of materialist approach to the cause of things that works very well for us after the fact for superficial things, like material things. Perhaps this area of creation, perhaps this area that we have a hard time answering with the unmoved mover, the infinite regress, the sequence, those questions, maybe it is quite right. Maybe it is improper to sort of expect the same types of intellectual paradigms that we use to explain superficial or short-term things to explain the infinite.
All right, so we'll leave it at that. We're going to bring on Doug finally, and we're going to start this. If you want to jump in, you can. I may even make you take my seat at some point, if that's all right with you.
Yeah.
So that we can get a dialogue between all three of us in some ways, kind of threesome.
Hey, Doug.
As you may say, this is,
Hello, Ms. Leslie.
again, Doug Harrison. Do you want to talk about what you do, or talk about who you are, how famous you are? And
Brilliant, famous.
he is
Incredibly
brilliantly famous.
And new to the life of Leslie.
You're
So it's
new?
200
To the life of
As
Leslie?
far as our listeners
Are you in love with her too? 'Cause
Absolutely
it's really,
true.
the competition's going to swamp.
Well, I think what's more important is that she's likely to be in love with me. She just hasn't had enough time yet. God, you guys talk fast on the show. It's
You know, I talk-
They do. That's why I lose them half the time. I'm like, what the hell?
Okay,
are
now
you
that's not what you
talking
said. You lost me because you said Kirk is better.
about? No, you. I did never say
I just
that.
remind our listeners that speed and accuracy are two different things.
No, girls have never accused me of speed and accuracy. Wait. No, they have accused me of speed.
All right, good. All right, so let's talk about Jesus.
Let's talk about you for a second. Is that still me?
Well,
Is that still talking about me?
We could me, Jesus. The two are often confused.
But we've got to
What
kind
can
of,
I do
we've
for
got
you,
to kind of,
Tell me what I
what's
can
it
do
called,
for
the
you.
three-way spirit, what was it again?
The three ways to the Trinitarian?
Yeah, the Trinity. Okay, talk about yourself just for a minute. I know that's hard to do, but tell us what you do. Tell us where you come from. Your background. You don't have to say what hospital you were born.
Right, okay. So the stuff is probably important to our listeners.
That's true.
Handsome, let's return to that. I want to spend our priorities. And I am the interim professor of ethics at the Episcopal Theological Seminary in the Southwest.
Okay.
And what it matters, which actually means I'm an ethicist. Epistemology is not my primary issue, which makes me interesting, I choose to believe, because I think it all hinges upon ethics. And so I'm the right person to be here, but not.
I'm all for you on that one.
So,
That ethics is the final arbiter.
I think it is. Absolutely. So, but I think that makes me interested in this whole issue. But I will certainly tip my hat to some of the technical aspects of the epistemologists.
We're not getting any technology out of this.
I don't know. Clearly. All right. So
We've got me and Craig fighting for Leslie's attention. You know. Even Kara's, for
when
that matter,
when
was
the
hiding in
whole
the
time
background.
I had stolen her heart at first glance.
Oh, no.
Hey, Kara.
Camera.
Okay.
What are you doing?
So,
Hiding? I don't gotta
I don't
ruin
want to be
the
on
whole.
camera.
You don't want to be on camera.
That's why I sit over here and
You slept with Robert Downey Jr. to get on camera, and now you're trying to hide your face.
What can I say? He wasn't that great.
That's my point. Anyway,
there is no God. That's it.
we're done. Show's over.
You won me over.
No, really
So
don't. We'd like to talk about Jesus.
let's talk about evidence for a little
Right.
bit.
Let's do it. So, what do you want to talk about in terms of evidence? See now, so, part of what I think you've set up for us, though, is that, and I think, so here's my agenda in this whole kind of conversation.
Okay.
That may be helpful to at least our listeners into hearing sort of what I do is, I think that a lot of what we have is a breakdown in the communication between people who hold staunch, we'll say, or maybe even fundamentalist atheist positions, and
Fundamentalist atheists.
sort of
We
Christian
call them Gnostic atheists.
or
Wait,
yes,
can you
right,
say capital
yes.
F?
Capital F
Fundamentalists?
fundamentalists.
Thank you.
Yes, capital F fundamentalists. Those would be okay. So capital F fundamentalists are the actual people who are part of the fundamentalist movement that begins in the 19th century here in the States. It's very particular and peculiar solely to the Christian faith.
Okay.
So fundamentalism writ large means something else, small f. But
Okay.
when we say fundamentalists, that means 5 particular tenets to which certain doctrinal people hold. So that's its own little animal to be dealt with. And it has a major influence on America and a major influence on the kind of conversations that we have about.
So when we hear about fundamentalists on the news, I mean, we are hearing about this group, or we're hearing about some relativized version
Fundamentalism
of
is
it.
just one of those words that we usually just throw out, and we apply it mostly to Christians and Muslims who we consider to be whack jobs. I mean, that's really how
Really?
it's used. I mean, that's what people say is that anybody who espouses a certain kind of Islam that's going to be violent towards America, they must be fundamentalists of some kind. I think that's it.
So it's a culturally defined word, which means
Yeah,
Christian
absolutely, and just thrown around, misused almost entirely. When we're talking about Christian fundamentalists, capital F fundamentalists, we're talking about a particular movement that began in the States at a certain time with a very epistemological basis to it that started some of the claims about the literal nature of interpretations of Scripture and about what sets up what we now consider evangelical prescriptions. A lot of them have been heavily influenced by capital F fundamentalism in the States. But that doesn't mean that is tantamount or is somehow analogically equivalent to other fundamentalist movements in other
Okay,
regions. So
all right.
just throwing that out there.
Okay.
You can
Well, I'm just
put that
personally, I was
out there.
interested in it, so that's good.
Right. So when we're talking about the conversations that we have often between faith systems, you might even say, of theism and atheism, that we actually end up talking past each other in a lot of ways, that a lot of the culture war debates get split up because people are simply dealing with entirely different sets of questions and talking about entirely different evidentiary systems. And in fact, it's because we're not even really trying to have a conversation. I think that most of it is the agenda to try to be right. And that doesn't really set us up so much for what we'd actually call an argument as a contradiction.
Is that anything related to the atheists that say, when they state their case, you just got pawned?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's
Well,
what
my first problem is that's what we say in WoW, and it's what's said in WoW stays in WoW.
See, pwn.
No, I don't like the word
I don't
pawn.
say that either.
I say pawn
It sounds
too.
like poon, and that's just wrong.
It's just, I don't like it. So please
Where does
continue
it
though.
go?
Because I think I'm saying the same thing. And just,
Pound.
I don't know.
well, they set it up as a battle. They set it up as you
Right.
just got knocked out rather than,
Well,
I welcome the challenge of a reasoned argument.
Yeah, and I think that there's a kind of fervency on both sides that really is more concerned, in particular, contradictions that we have with each other in really proving that one is right and that one's way of life that one has chosen is sustainable and most obviously truthful. And that's, one can find successes then in owning the other person. And
But you're not saying that there is no right necessarily.
owning the other person.
Owning the other person.
Yeah, no, I think that there is the greatest success is really to shut the other person down, and I think that that's a certain way of proceeding through some of these arguments that can be particularly not helpful to the philosophical inquiry. You know, that if you're really looking at notions of truth or thinking about religion from a philosophical or psychological or sociological perspective, that you have a very different set of inquiries. So I think that the question of evidence is a really good one, but it might help us to start to say, look, these are different systems of evidence with different agendas, different kinds of questions, and neither of them will probably be set up to be obvious in any particular way. That's just the other person like, oh, you know, it's like nobody that I have ever met in my life has ever picked up a soda cup from In-N-Out Burger and saw that it had John 3:16 written on the bottom and suddenly converted. In the same way, have I never been attacked by some sort of semi-rational inundation of scientific evidence about how evolution is stupid, and that even come close to, adjusting my faith to have to deal with that particular conversation. Now, there are things that make me engage and have to be more intellectually rigorous about my faith. That's just not usually one of them.
Right.
So that's...
And that's where you're saying these conversations need to be going.
Right, absolutely.
And how does someone go about that then? I mean, because I think we've outlined the way not to do it. Or the thing that we're worried about people doing if they plan to have a real conversation.
I would be interested. I think this would be a really great time if you're after listening. Go ahead and start contacting us now. I mean, this would be really interesting to see just the kinds of questions that come up in that whenever we start talking about the existence of God or whether somebody, which I consider to be a very different question about whether somebody should be of a certain faith or not, is a related but different question. Do we find a lot of things, but what do you say about a Bible? What do you do with dinosaurs? Or how about, or you throw out an abortion debate or something that really is much more indicative about where somebody falls in culture wars and is more concerned about just proving that one is right and being able to sustain.
Well, we do have a question. The question is fairly basic, but I think it's it makes sense to ask it.
Right.
And that is, and if you're going to be familiar with it, that someone wants to know just if we're going to enter a serious discussion, then if we're going to take it seriously, how do we deal with the problem of evil?
The problem of evil. Yes, small question. Let's just throw that out there. The problem of evil.
Well, what I mean by that is so many people have heard it and debated it.
Right.
It doesn't seem like a particularly sneaky question.
No, I think it's actually a really good question. I think that it's actually.
You want to talk about what it is first?
It's pertinent. Yeah, the problem of evil is, in short, I mean, it's just the question of how can there be a benevolent God in the broadest sense.
If the world is like my love life.
If the world is like, or yes, if the world is
Jim's
like
suffering is actually
Jim's suffering is
disproof
proof.
of the benevolent God.
How can there be a loving God?
And if you knew how much suffering I had to do at the hands of women, there could be no God.
So there can be no, right, exactly. Right, that, or, the
problem of
tsunami
evil, right
in
there.
Indonesia, we can talk about that as well.
I think that makes more sense to people.
Similar. So,
Nobody cares about
I mean, this is the tsunami and some of Katrina. Some of this has brought up good questions, and I think that the natural disasters are particularly difficult in talking about
Exactly.
the problem of evil, because
That's
with
what Richard
world wars you
Swinburne
can always
said,
blame
if you
people.
read Swinburne.
Right. So with questions of World War II, how can there be Hitler? Well, you could say because people are idiots. You can sort of blame humanity for that, but when it comes to something like a tsunami, you really have to deal with creation and the nature of the creator and the nature of the creator's relationship and means of working within creation has to be
Right. So you've outlined the question. So what do we expect from that kind of debate? What do we expect from a Protheist standpoint in response to that if they articulate it in that way? 'Cause I think Swinburne also had a big problem with the natural disaster when he pointed it out ahead of time. I'm not going to be able to deal with this as easily.
Well, I don't want to. I'm going to ask a question that's mostly rhetorical. Is to say that well, let me say this. I think that most people that this comes up as the issue because the presumption is that there cannot be evil in the world if there was a benevolent God. That the existence of a benevolent God must be coterminous with a perfect world.
Right.
Which there has to be some way of accounting for that then. And the way that Christians have done that is actually quite a complex story. And at no point have Christians, I think, ever sustainably put a simple argument forward. And this is the nature of particularly Christian and Jewish faith, is that it's not about objective truths in the way that you can find answers in science with a single symbol at the end of an equation, but that Christians tend to tell stories. And I think the earliest theodicy, the earliest story that Christians continue to tell over and over again that is dealing with the problem of evil is the story of Job, who went through all of this suffering, and that the answer within Job is a kind of participation, is that the answer is that there's something about how God chooses to act within the world, and that human beings being part of God's work within the world,
Right.
that is an ethical response. And it sets up, in the narrative sense, it sets it up for these people to understand who they are and what their mission
That's
is.
actually what Swinburne says. It's the exact same thing. And I've always had a problem with that Swinburne essay. And the reason for that, first of all, I like to say that like the way I get my sympathy for that position, the protheist position on that, which is I don't have a whole bunch of sympathy except when I'm drunk, but is the argument Leibniz makes. You know anything about Leibniz? And he said that he was a Christian, but there was questions about that because of the time period in which he was
Well, George Bush says he's a Christian, so we have to.
philosophizing.
Yes, right.
Well, for different reasons. George Bush says he's a Christian because it's safer, and Leibniz said he was a Christian despite the fact that it was not safe to say that he was anything other. But Leibniz's theory was about compossible worlds, and he puts it fairly eloquently, and that is that when we think about the word perfect and the word evil, what might be a better way of looking at it, and I hate to do what other protheists say, but what I'm doing is defining my way of understanding what you're saying, and it's through Leibniz. And that is that, kind of like in the Matrix, where the first creators of the Matrix itself, software, designed everything perfectly, and nobody was happy, and nobody had meaning in their life, and no one understood what good and bad meant. And they had to shake everything up and try to create a world that provided for people in every way they needed to be provided for. And I think what Leibniz is saying is that ultimately there's an infinite number of ways to build a world. And of all these compossible worlds, there's one world that works most perfectly, which is not to say perfect the way we want it to be, which is devoid of evil, let's say. Does that make sense? So what Leibniz is saying is what we find ourselves in is the perfect balance between good and evil in such a way that what he created, the human animal, finds its best expression. And it could be that this evil is a way of explaining to man what not to do.
Yeah, I think that it largely, and I don't want us to derail too far and to spend the evening on the Odyssey, but I think that this is a great example. Maybe we can get back to epistemology through this, but that Christians would have to reject something like that outright, because I think that Christians would not be able to sustain, at least in a teleological sense, that the world is supposed to be someplace that's a balance of good and evil, that there's some sort of appearance of suffering that's necessary for the world to be as it is. But that's to be rejected outright, because the nature of our story, which says it was created in the image of God, that the whole creation bears the marks of God, who exists in a perfect exchange, a perfect economy of love,
Right.
opportunity, and does not have the kind of excesses and defects that would make things like a tsunami possible.
Well, my problem has always been, I guess, semantic in a sense. Like, if I'm going to accept Leibniz, I'm going to accept you in any way rationally. My only response is, if you're perfect and have some kind of control, I don't care about the degree. I know how screwed up the world is to the extent that I know, through evidence, I know through my own personal experience in this world that it could have been done better. That there's no balance about this disaster.
Right.
I'm not looking at this world like, well, there's some good things about it. And God is ultimately responsible for everything, including us.
Except that we've removed a step, saying that, I think that there's that element of participation which is essential to the very nature of being Christian, about the degree to which one participates in God, that becomes an essential part of that. I mean, there is human volition, so that we can say that, yes, in my own personal experience, I know that I can imagine a world better than this, and that's fantastic, that's good. In fact, I think that one of the reasons for being Christian is that you help embody a story that makes imagining a world that's more perfect than the way it is now possible,
Right.
and therefore to make it ethically, even likely or possible, in a concrete sense.
But I mean, Socrates even said the same thing, but doesn't that kind of, in a way, question God's omnipotence and perfection? Just by reasoning alone, doesn't that suggest that God doesn't have ultimate control over us?
Well, there's a couple.
You understand what I'm saying?
No, I mean, there's definitely a couple responses to that. I mean, the one, I think,
Like, he could have designed us better,
order.
and he wasn't able to.
True. There are two responses. Actually, there's a series of responses. One is to say, there's a lot of people who actually take that position philosophically, and you find it in process theology or process thought that does sort of subject God to the possibilities of change. It says, no, God really isn't perfect in a sense, and God does change. And I have a number of reasons for rejecting this outright, even though it does seem to deal with quickly the theodicy problem. There's another way, though, of saying that And this is, I think, the problem that people make with all of these arguments, which, like the modus argument, the immovable mover, tracing most of those back to Aquinas, which are usually different versions of something that Aquinas usually did. I'm losing my train of thought. We're talking to
Don't do it now. We just got featured on Snickum, which is thousands of people watching.
Awesome. Hi, guys. Welcome to the broadcast.
Welcome all to the room. If you'd like to ask questions, please ask them in red. We're talking about evidence in the religious argument.
So, yeah, right. So we were talking about the problem of evil in particular, but when we're talking about what were we talking about?
You hit the unmoved mover and
The unmoved
the regress.
mover
I think you were segueing into the
We
sort
can
of
go back to
relevancy
Leslie if
of
you
that to one's attitude towards God and its perfection. You were
Okay, whether God is perfect or not. But yes, Aquinas wants us to know that Aquinas is not a theist. Aquinas is a Christian. This would be a great distinction, is that Aquinas,
This ought to be interesting.
when he's talking about actually even knowing God, the possibility of knowing God, it's a very limited chapter when he gives like his 5 reasons for the existence of God, and moves immediately into saying if you're going to know God, you really have to talk about the Trinity. Because one can't sort of know godness or deity, but one has to know actually that God which actually does exist. And so the peculiarities, and to do that, one has to engage what is known through revelation as well as what's known through other means of knowledge. But so the tradition and knowing the whole construct, a whole universe of claims and their relationship to each other is what is necessary to know whether there is a God or not. Which one can sort of argue is to say that if one wants to know, according to Aquinas, whether there is a God or not, one has to read the whole of the Summa. I mean, that one has to know the peculiarities of who God is that God is not universal in the sense that it's a blank. God is not a tabula rasa, a deity, but it's actual sort of has personality, if you will. I mean, that looks like something. And so if the world is going to be created to be like that, has to bear the marks that look something like the economy of the Trinity, and have to look like.
But that scares me as a questioner, or as a philosopher, or even as a non-believer, because I mean that makes God look kind of like an asshole. Like,
yeah, no, and that's
You
a
see
really good
what I mean?
question.
From my perspective,
Absolutely,
it-
but see, this is a much more interesting question than whether the world is 6,000 years old, is whether or not God is an asshole.
oh, I could go on all day. I could go on all day because that's ultimately my question. Even if you brought him here in the room, which would satisfy every atheist on the planet, they would say, except me and Christopher Hitchens. You know, I guess Craig. Maybe you bring God here and say, here he is. Like, thank God I don't have to sit here and debate this stupidity anymore. Can I kick the guy in the nuts?
Yeah, no, this is a really good question, and I think this is the kind of conversations that I crave and I long for, and I really like for people to have.
But don't you feel pawned?
No, not at all. Not the slightest, because the question of who God really is
I just wanted
within
to
the
say-
world is I'm going to say pawn. Hi, Mom. Pawn. Pawn.
Hey, we're saying it wrong.
I don't even know.
7 million WoW people right now are mad at us for saying pawn.
I've never played
right.
WoW.
It's quite right.
I never even know what ZONG means.
I'm just a typo for own. Is it?
It is a
Yes,
typo.
it's a typo
for
for
own.
own. That's why you know it's pronounced pwned, not pawned.
We're all excited about a typo. Anyway, I really don't want to. I don't want to derail it too
Okay.
far.
We
into comedy.
actually, guys, for some of our viewers who just tuned in, we did have a question that I guess shows that some of them are new to the show. The question is,
Is it a big question?
No, do you guys believe in God? So I think probably
It's not a bad question. I mean,
No.
everyone else is
for
afraid of that
people who
question.
can't just assert from what you're saying what your beliefs may or may not be.
I would be happy to do it.
Spell it out
I mean,
for them.
I'm a practicing Christian. Yeah, I'm a Christian theologian.
Okay, so you
by
don't believe in
training,
God.
too, so.
And-
Right. No, I was at Mass moments before I showed up here tonight.
I don't believe Christians believe in God.
So do you believe in Jesus?
I do, and well, I want to know what you mean by believe.
This
but
show is not the
I am a
historicity
Christian.
of Jesus.
So I am a Christian. I
Right, it would be
study the
crazy not to
Nicene
believe in
Creed,
Jesus then.
and I adhere to the bulk of the tradition in a critical way. I mean,
Okay, crazy person. So
I'm an academic and intellectual, so I've engaged it. But yeah, I am a practicing Roman Catholic.
okay,
Sure.
good. Does anyone want to say what they believe? Just because there are a lot of other people in the show. Leslie, do you believe in God? Simple question.
I
Don't
believe
mince
in
words.
something.
I'd call it
A
agnostic.
raspberry would just say, do you believe in God? And take the question really simply.
Not the Christian God specifically, no, but I do believe that there are entities or
Okay.
an entity that
Area 51. Okay, you're a crazy person.
I agree pretty much with Leslie. I personally define the Christian God to be
She put your arm around you. You agree with her.
You could everyone's be incoherent, but also
Can I
I
just
think more
drown
importantly,
myself
I
and you
don't.
can take over hosting the show.
Yeah.
I don't.
That sounds fine.
I don't really.
Greg does
align
not believe in
myself
God. Let me speak for
Hold on,
him.
hold on.
What's up?
So the question was then, Leslie, are you an agnostic?
an agnostic. Find that, please.
Well, the viewer that asked that question, define what you mean by agnostic.
No, agnostic means you don't have any information to believe in a God, which is separate from an agnostic.
No,
Yeah.
I think I have information to believe in a larger.
So you're a theist and not a Christian.
Well, I think there's, to be fair, there are many definitions of the term agnostic. I think the way Leslie's trying to apply it at the moment is that she doesn't subscribe to any of the popular theisms that are present, but the notion of deity, the notion of a God makes sense to her. The notion of being a consciousness that has a will.
I'm
That,
not sure that's what she said, but
Yeah, a larger consciousness.
that's because you and Craig are so connected.
No, but
Craig, do you believe in a God? We can't do this all night, so Craig, do you believe in God, yes or no?
I specifically reject Christian God because I don't agree with his plan if he existed, and I also think he doesn't exist because I find the description incoherent. I personally do think it's more likely than not that there are beings which have greater control over the universe than we do, which I take as the loose definition of a God.
Yeah, I would, I hate to say it, I don't disagree with Craig. I think it's highly probable there are beings that have better technology than we do. I find that completely unlike any definition I've ever heard from the word God, and that is why I reject God almost entirely in
I'm a
that
little
regard.
offended. You
And I
didn't
reject
ask me.
relativism. What?
I'm a little offended you didn't ask me.
No, I was about to ask you, except that I figured you were God, so I thought it was pointless to ask you if you believe in yourself.
It's true.
Kara, do you believe in a God?
I believe in aliens.
Okay, so what we've discovered is everyone's completely insane.
This is crazy. How did I
It's
end
called
up here
Earth.
tonight? Was I drinking before I got here? Am I drinking
No,
now?
but you
Why
wish,
am I not drinking
you
now?
wish you were
I
drinking
think
now.
I have philosophy without beer.
We all need a cocktail.
I think that's the question we were trying to ask all night: is how did you get here? Was it through God?
Was it God?
through the Christian God?
God's will.
Divine
We'll
intervention.
start with my Isuzu hombre. But no, okay. So we were talking earlier though
Right.
about, in some really productive way, about was it the Odyssey and.
Well, I mean,
feel like I've left it.
it was
Oh no,
a problem
the
with
question
evil.
about whether we
Right.
believe in God. Yeah.
Somebody wanted the basic question. Actually, that person has left the room. I think they were offended.
That wouldn't surprise me at all. But
I'm
we're
sorry
still
about
featured. There's
that.
still thousands of people popping this browser up, so we're gonna
Yeah,
have to
their name
entertain
is
them.
also Pirate Queen.
Hi, Pirate Queens.
I'm starting to sense something here. Okay, so
I'm
we
sure-
were talking about the problem of evil, I
Come
think.
on back to us. It's a good conversation. Right. No problem. With
And I think, again, I just want to restate my position, which is that I do feel like a materialist in the sense that I live a real life, and my experiences with that real life seem to indicate so many problems that are deeper than just, I made a bad decision today. And these problems, if there were to be a designer, seem to be his or her responsibility to no small degree.
No, but that seems to me to be a move that I wouldn't necessarily make as quickly or with the kind of veracity that you do. I mean, there's.
Well, I've thought this out. I mean,
I'll grant you that to be sure. No one talks as fast as you do without at least having.
I must have been born on the East Coast and didn't know it, because there's no doubt about that.
But there certainly is a place in which I think that we have to say that there are things that we attribute to what we want God to be, and there are things in which, if somebody's going to make a claim about God, you have to actually say God actually is, and that there has to be the room, if there is a God, and this is just, let me just set this out as an intellectual premise. I mean, if there is a God, the possibility of God being disappointing to somebody's expectations has to be out there as well. And that doesn't necessarily mean just because somebody can't be disappointed with God means that there isn't a God.
But it relativizes the term God for me again, just like it did a minute ago.
I'm not sure it has to, the way you use the word relativize, I think, is a bit of darting out of the question, because I don't think, no, I think it's not relativizing, I think it's questioning. I think it does have to change. This is good engagement, this is good argument. What are your expectations, and what's, like, even to be able to say things like, psychologically,
Just common
what do
sense
you need to be
expectations.
able to, I don't think it's common, because your question's not the same as other people's. I think that
Common sense from anyone, yeah, most people don't have brains, that's my problem.
no, see,
Why
it's
can't
not
get a
common
girlfriend?
sense. But what common sense of everybody who agrees with you? Now that's not common sense. That's something a little bit different.
No, it's everyone that agrees with reality.
No, because okay, there is a God, and it's Jim.
Oh, well, if you're going to put it that way, I mean,
I
No,
thought I
no,
was
no, no.
God.
bringing it back around to epistemology, which I'm starting to
No,
really
I
enjoy.
think that you're asking the question about the nature of God and being able to say that the possibility of God existing in a way that doesn't make me happy can happen at the same time. That's part of the problem with Descartes' ontological problem, is that it is both almost an entirely subjective intellectual move. And ironic that we call it ontological, like it's actually talking about being.
Right.
Because it's really talking about a certain kind of understanding which subjects God to a certain kind of understanding. Which I think we have to say that it's possible for a being to be perfect, and if we are imperfect, for there to be the experience of disappointment in discovering perfection. The perfection is not what you wanted it to look like.
Right,
And that's
but again, now
intellectual.
you're making sense about God being perfect, God being omnipotent, God having created us. So wouldn't he make us better decision makers? That's always been my basic question about all this problem of evil business.
Well,
He has total control of how we
no,
make
you're
sense.
moved. You keep going back to total control in a way that not everybody does. I think total
But
control.
it doesn't matter if I do it the same way other people do. The question is whether I'm right.
Well, and I think that what I'm going to bring into question is what your notion of total control is. If we're going to talk about God, this is the
Right.
kind of engagement that I like, and I want to keep coming back to this. Watch what we're doing. This,
Right. I totally
Here's an
agree with
interesting conversation. Here's
When we
an
start fist fighting, yeah, not that. But
Right.
this part of it,
we're going beyond contradictions here is to say, okay, so what I'm hearing you say is that you've got a notion of total control that must be subscribable to God in order for God to be God. And that plays into some of what we've said about the teleological position, as well as the cosmological position. There has to be some things that we can fill in the blank about what perfection would be, but ultimately that's the ontological position of saying there is this idea of perfection that must be able to be tautological somehow, or it must come back around to prove its own self in its very state.
so you're more amenable to the Cartesian argument, is what you're saying, I think.
No, I think that I largely really hate what Descartes did, but I hate the second half of that too, which is
Right.
we use Descartes' way of thinking and want to accomplish the kinds of argument building that he does, which is real foundational. It's trying to look out the window and see how a building goes from the bottom up. He wants to strip everything down to its basis foundation and build back up. And this is kind of how we like to do our thinking anymore, thinking about certitude. This perfect.
You would equate this with science.
Yeah, and I would
Right,
think that
empirical
but that's
method.
but I would disagree with the overall project. So when we start talking about materialist atheists
And I'm the opposite. I agree with the project and don't like the result.
and don't like the result of Descartes,
Right.
see, because what I don't think that we do well is to talk about materialism, which I want to attach to what we're doing with Descartes is that we get into this talking about what's seeable, what's obvious, and some commonsensical kind of language that Descartes takes away at the very beginning of his project. And so that second half of his whole early ontological moves of I think therefore I am is sort of a response to this idealistic empiricist sort of problem. And he ends up in this place of ideas, which ultimately
Right.
for him is God. But I think that we are better to at least temper that with some of the other conversations as well. We can't take just half of what he's saying, like just that ontological position. There must be a God because I can imagine something perfect. The very problem being is because maybe you suck at thinking about what perfect is.
Right.
I mean, maybe you're imperfect.
Right.
So
and-
if that's possible, now we have to say, well, then how can we imagine God, or what sort of things might we do to? Because I will agree that we can't put God
But
under a
that's
microscope.
almost like an Augustine move, saying we really know nothing.
Yeah, I really love Augustine too. Now I wouldn't say it's nothing,
Whoa!
but I'm Augustine and Aquinas. I'm a classic. I'm an orthodox guy here, and I think that.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you're sticking to it, but I mean, then we are talking about debasing human beings and asceticism and really trying to then posit the argument that that has been this thing which has taken away man's ability
No.
to say it's common sense to say the world can't be this
I
messed
would say
up.
that's a really bad reading of Augustine. I think there's a difference between Christians who make the claims that humans are
Well, I've read
fallen.
Augustine, and it's blatantly anti-man.
I would disagree with that.
I'm not saying that he saw it as anti-man. I'm saying anyone with any common sense would see it as anti-man.
No, I think that I would say.
Unless you
anybody-
hate man, then I
would
guess
say
it's not
that you
anti-man.
would, I would say that if you read it in part from the position of the 21st century without some critical uptake of it, certainly I would agree with that. But I am an Augustinian to be sure, and actually in the camp, by the company I keep call themselves critical Augustinians. But it's a critical postmodern uptake of the guy that says, let's make sense of what's going on here, that there's a logic to what he's doing. So yeah, I am, but I am suspicious epistemologically about what humans are individually capable of, yes. That's actually also built into the particular narrative that I work with of being Christian. I mean, Aquinas is not thinking only as a philosopher, he's a theologian talking within the Christian moral construct of a particular account of human beings that includes them once having been
But
perfect
this is the biggest critique
and now
of,
not being perfect.
this is the biggest critique of the whole Christian thing, is that it debases
I'm
man.
going to quote you on that. This is the biggest.
I do. I think it is.
All right, go ahead.
I think it is, and it is that Christianity as a philosophy, which it has to be in some ways, is ultimately a debasing aesthetic process. Which means if you're going to debase a creature that far, including the people in that system talking about Christianity, you're going to limit their ability and their confidence to come up with anything true. If you're taking away their ability to find truth,
No, I would say that, again, I think that from a modernist perspective, that use of Augustine makes sense to me. That's not how Augustine would have wanted to be used, because he
We
also
say the same thing about
operates
Jesus
within-
as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, well, I know, but that's why we
I've
have
never
to do.
fallen for that.
But that's critical historical work that we're doing then, and we have to think about Aquinas and with his context, and the fact that he also works liturgically and within a community. I think that he doesn't believe in the total inevitable depravity and inevitable irredeemability or
But it has to be a attachment to God. I mean, that's the redemption is pretty conventional. Isn't
More
it?
importantly, I think that he would believe that every human is already attached to God, like it or not.
Well, it's finding it.
Yeah, I mean, not even finding it. Every human being has no ontology aside from God, and that's a part of Augustine that we frequently miss.
Right.
His
No, I mean,
writings
I would
on the
agree with you,
Trinity. A lot of people who read Augustine as a philosopher skip the theological stuff because it's about God, but you can't do that because it's what he does specifically in De Trinitate that makes sense of some of the claims that he makes about his anthropology. His anthropology is a second step move of talking about humanity in its particular historical relationship to God, which is not as it always has been according to our story. So that humans and God have been in different kinds of relationships, were meant for different kinds of relationships, but are in a particular relationship right now, which means human beings have to be particularly critical about some of their own convictions and suspicious about certain things of what they are morally and intellectually capable of. So in this sense, I mean, he is a brilliant skeptic, but one who, if anything, is quite more positive about the nature and the future of human beings.
But certainly the
than
history
skeptic.
coming from Augustine wasn't something that promoted skepticism, but
No, it was. I think it
Bias.
was. I think that when you look at both the patristics around Augustine and before Augustine, you see similar thought to this.
and you don't find people after Augustine behaving properly.
You
You
do,
see
and you
dramatic
don't.
decline.
You do, because, and there's some sociological and historical reasons for that, which I think are really important. So now I'm being in the position of defending Christianity, and let's go ahead with that. No, I will.
Okay.
But I want to just again, I want to sort of get to the meta discussion as saying, okay, look at the kind of conversation that we're having. Is that now we're talking about the actual historical constructs that have worked over time, particular moments in Christian history. But this isn't just a certain claim about whether I can work it out in my mind about how to think about dinosaurs. But I'm looking about what Christians actually did and are doing now in relationship to like the Middle Ages and to what happened in the immediate establishment of the Constantinian Empire.
But you have to
Christianity.
understand. You have to understand the non-believer perspective, and that is that Christianity and Augustine and Aquinas and the reversal of Aristotelian logic, if that's what it is, certainly that's what I see it as, has produced directly the kind of decline that makes me say that people aren't doing the right
I think
thing.
that would be historically inaccurate. I would agree with you that there are
But you
moments.
can't say that there's not a confluence of the things. You can say that I'm taking out a
I
confluence
would
of
want
the
a
mistake.
good academic to show me the places where there are correlations in places where, and I want to introduce the language of the church because to me that becomes really
I
important.
mean, the Inquisition.
Talks about, great example. I
Okay.
want to talk about the Inquisition particularly in its relationship to the state and the distance from its own tradition at that particular time. So at the point of the Inquisition
Right,
was a
and I
time when
understand
Christians
that.
were not really being very Christian, but were very much involved with state.
But they're never being Christian. I mean, that's what the atheists are complaining about.
Historically, you have-
Historically, they haven't been very Christian, and they haven't been at all Christian, really.
I think you have to. I think history disagrees with you. Now, I would have to say,
Well, you're disagreeing with reality. You're not disagreeing with
no.
I don't have
no.
opinion.
If you were still, that's right, because you're God. I've forgotten
No, I'm just.
There's a God and it is-
I'm the representative of reality. That doesn't mean I'm God.
that you are.
I just point out facts. That's all I'm
That's
saying.
all you do. All
I
right.
don't have an ability to have an opinion, A, because women slap me, and B, because reality comes to me.
I think that here's a great example. That when you have the downfall of the Roman Empire, and you have a great deal of chaos, and particularly embodying itself in the forms of violence, you also have
Which
the
came because
establishment.
of Constantine's embracing of Christianity.
Agreed, and I would think that there's a good deal of theologians, of which I'm not. I'm a partial member of this camp. There's a significant number of thinking Christians who recognize that the Constantinian move was both disingenuous and a mistake.
I don't
This
think he
is
was
not-
Christian. I don't think he.
Yeah,
I don't think he was
this was.
sympathetic with Christianity. I think he was sympathetic with trying to be the one ruler of Rome.
I think Christians would agree with that. A lot of Christians would agree with that, and certainly there are movements that would
But
very
it's
much
getting-
immediately throw. So what
The point
happens
is
is we have
violence.
the establishment of Constantine, the Christian Empire, and when you have the fall of the Roman Empire, the first fall of the Roman Empire, you also have the simultaneous establishment of things like the Benedictine monasteries. who actually retreat from certain aspects of society and go to establish other kinds of societies and end up being places that do things like save bits of education and save bits
They
of
hide the books
culture.
because they're not allowed to have them, and they
Right.
lock them in turrets.
And so then we do have to look at that aspect of Christianity, and then question to what extent, and can we demonstrate whether they are close to the tradition and the Jesus tradition, or whether they are far. And I would say, yes, they can. We can do that. Again, that's a huge conversation we probably wouldn't open up and get into, but it's possible. That's a different
So
conversation.
you're trying to separate this history of violence from the history of Christianity. You're saying there's other reasons to believe that the Dark Ages and the Inquisitions and all of these movements that seem to come from a lack of philosophy. Which
I
is
don't want to separate. I want to critically engage, because I still think the church is responsible for mistakes that it made. I don't want to say, oh, that wasn't the church at all. No, that was where the church kind of screwed things up. But I can also demonstrate changes in the church's liturgy, developments in the ordination of emperors and places, and the birth of the nation state really starts at this time. I mean, I really believe that if you're really going to be Christian, you have to be something like an anarchist. That's its conversation, different conversation.
Which is, again, this
you
Jesus
know,
perspective.
that there is, yeah, but there has to be this sort of critical engagement of the state, and I think that if we really look at history, and not in broad sweeping categories, but look at what happens over the years, particularly in the church's relationship to the state, then suddenly we have a very different understanding of what needs to be said about the nature of God, and what the existence of the church says about the nature of God that isn't really about,
Right.
you know.
And I get where you're coming from in terms of this, the message versus the result, you know, or the Nietzsche versus the Hitler thing. And we do have another question that's related to this, and it talks about specifically what we just said. They're responding to what we said, and they want to know if we can take Jesus and say, as somebody who was revolting against the harshness and maybe the incoherence of some of the Jewish doctrine. I mean, is that what we can say, or some of the Old Testament, and some of maybe what Jesus saw as the practical problems related to that kind of faith?
Well, one can't say as a Christian, and I want to be careful about that, because I mean, you really can say whatever you want to. One can actually say with some academic rigor that Jesus was, I guess, resisting the Jews, but I think that a Christian...
And he's critical of them.
Yes.
I think that's what I'm trying to say.
Christians would have to agree that he was...
I don't think he was existed, but I will say.
This is part of the doctrine of him being the incarnation of God, though, is that he fulfills the law, so he was here to be a corrective to the law, not just to be a resistance to it.
Clearly. And so what I'm saying, and in a sense, this is part of my problem with the metaphysics, maybe, and that is, and this is the question that this person is asking, is that the Jesus message itself, if we keep returning to that, saying, here's the Jesus message versus the Jesus result. Here's the Jesus message, or the Augustinian message, or even the Nietzschean message in terms of just this process of perverting a message. If we look at the Jesus message and then we say all this violence was done, and we can't equate this back in the same way we say the church went astray from an original Christ of faith concept or message. What we find, and I agree with this, the question is, can we look at the original message, which people don't choose to do, and look at it as a perversion of morality? Which is to say, we never think that now because we've been rooted in Jesus for 2,000 years, and even capitalism kind of grew out of a moral climate in which we look at altruism as a kind of fundamental, rather than what the Greeks did, which was competition.
There are plenty of Christian theologians that would say, Dietrich Bonhoeffer is, I think, a good example that says that there is something horrific. I mean, the Garden of Eden story and the idea, the knowledge of good and evil being a certain binary, saying that there was no ethics before the fall. There was no morality before the fall. So in this sense, if Jesus is sort of bombasts morality, well, yes, I mean, that morality in and of itself is not a good thing. It's us trying to make sense out of a world that's not fitting together as it's meant to fit together. And so the very existence of ethics is the state of us not really seeing God clearly.
Okay, but then again, you bring it right back to my first complaint, which is now I looked at Augustine as debasing man, and now you're saying the man shouldn't even attempt to understand ethics.
No.
Or he's not going to. He shouldn't be confident in anything in terms of explaining his ethics. He's not going to be successful as he attempts to understand.
I wouldn't say that either. I think it would be different than what we talk about it in both communitarian terms and in liturgical terms. I mean, this is why things
Those are
like
awfully big words for
the
me.
Eucharist,
Let me draw a
becomes
picture
so
of my
important.
brain, what it looks like in
I do,
actual
I
size.
do. I just want to know because
This is what you're dealing with when you use words like liturgical.
liturgical. I found a big word you don't know.
You're using a brain about this big.
The
Has something to do with
whole
liturgy, maybe?
of a philosophy show on the internet has to be to use words that somebody else in the room doesn't
That's
understand.
right.
To be perfectly honest with you, I'd rather have a show about that. Let's quit religion and let's talk about how bad philosophers have been for 2,000 years, and that's why this Christ the faith idea has appealed to so many people who have no options because they're listening to Kant the moron.
Right, okay, I'm with you there.
And my next guest is Ayn Rand, and she's here to tell you
Yeah.
why I hate
So
philosophy.
let me
by
give
Ayn
a quick response. So I think that
Yeah, do that.
my actual response, I think, would say, yes, there are ways of approaching that says that it's not about individual thought exercises, but about communal, moral, and ethical shared embodiments that also have within their story the conviction that God is working within that God actually is part of that community. Not in any sort of magical way, but that Jews are God trying to set creation right, that Christianity
These
is
Roman
the
Jews.
incarnation of, no, this is Judaism. That
But what I'm saying is I've never heard a good message. Like even if this is what most atheists do, I think, and non-believers and agnostics do, is they say, yes, I don't disagree with what Jesus said, and I think this is what this person is saying. I don't disagree with what Jesus said. I just think everything that's come after that has been bad. And the atheists say, from the perspective of evil thing, we've misinterpreted Jesus' message, and no one disagrees with Jesus' message except me. And Christopher Hitchens.
I wouldn't say that there isn't great anecdotal experiential evidence for that out there. Of course, I think that's a very legitimate position to hold. I also think that that's not an entirely engaging look at history that sees that there are other aspects of the church who had these critical engagement, and there's a difference that you can demonstrate in really rigorous intellectual ways that says
But where is
the
this good
people
church?
behind it exists. And
I mean, I like you, so there's something to this, but really, when we deal with the church in commonsensical terms, the people that believe in Jesus Christ, none of these people are doing things or have ever done anything that makes sense to me philosophically.
okay,
All the way to Jesus, crazy man.
I really like where the conversation is going, because I think that this is sort of the epistemological problem of what the embodiment. Truthfulness has everything to do with the communities that subscribe to it are able to embody. Let me say that again. The truthfulness has everything to do with whether the communities that subscribe to it are capable of embodying that truth. So that if you have some sort of claim that makes perfect rational sense, but no community is capable
This
of
is why no one
embodying
listens to
that,
me.
yeah, that if there is no community that you can sustain around it, that it is dismissible. I think that there are huge aspects of the church that do exist that I'm a part of, that I try to participate in myself and to invent and to be a
But
part of.
are you talking about something else? Can I just call it Star Trek? I mean, you're talking about something other than everything I know. I mean, I know it exists because I've known you for some time, but there is a whole other thing called Christianity, which is evil. You're starting something else. We pick another word for it.
No, I won't pick another word for it because we had it first. But
Well, then make them pick another word.
I'm
You're
trying to.
confusing that. Again,
I
can we
think
go
it's
back to
right.
this pea brain?
But I think that
It's not fair to me.
The matter of Christians having really good conversations with other Christians about what it means to be Christian in the world. See, I
Will
think
help this problem.
would really help this problem. So
And that's
whole-
again more what you mean about conversation.
part of the reason I teach is that one of my agenda and what I think would make the Christian faith entirely radical is just to ask the church to be the church. Now, what we
But
have
what is it?
instead-
Can I ask you that? Just
Well, let me just be soundbitey about it and then come
Okay,
back to
all
it.
right.
So if I would say, let the church be the church, and it would be this radical thing that we talk about. The problem with why that's so difficult to see or to constitute is because for some conspiracy type reasons and just for some practical reasons. One is there are massive majorities of people that see Christianity in such an individualistic way and are so far from the tradition but have such a massive voice. I mean, so that you have us watching on the internet today, we were talking about some of this earlier, where there's these groups of people that are so much about having this individual subjective buddy-buddy relationship with Jesus without any really critical engagement with really scripture or the tradition
or just the basics of
Indeed.
Jesus, which was about altruism.
Right, so that without...
That makes me want to kill him.
Yes, well, granted. And so that when you have that, I do indeed want to call that something different. And in fact, the church has called groups heresies before. And I
I'm
think
calling
that-
you a heresy.
Well,
Oh, well, I guess it would be a heretic.
you don't get to do that. I'd like to be the whole heresy.
You're the whole heresy. You're the whole thing. Let's take Kara's question really quick before
Yeah,
we forget
sure.
to.
No, you actually kind of touched on it a little bit already.
We
One of the-
want an external question.
One of the viewers actually wanted to know then, by and large, would you say that throughout history and time, Christians really are just misguided?
No, I'd say yes and no. I mean, of course there are places in
Except
which
your secret church.
it's not secret, but okay.
Dude, it's a secret.
But part of one of the things I
I'm
want to
joining it.
let me sound like an all-out conspiracy theorist because I love it. It's fun. But part of any good church is going to be, in its existence, a threat by being a culturally affiliated group of people who have a favoritism for the poor, for instance, is going to make them a threat to any particular nation state.
That's a threat
and
to
so
me.
I think that we are telling stories about the nature of the church that even make religion the problem of the Middle Ages, when I think it was the birth pangs of the nation state who started drawing arbitrary lines, establishing the
Okay.
lines of violence, that's the fundamental disease there. So yeah, this is a different telling of history, but I think that you can demonstrate it and you can do it
Let
critically.
me ask you a constructive question then. What is a good thing about your secret church? Of course, I'm creating some kind of straw man. Like, what is the one good thing? Because you've separated yourself from all the evil, and I think it was smart to do that. And you've said that there are a lot of people that engage in this, there are a lot of people who believe in these things in the right way, in the ways that you do it. What is the good thing about this, right, that doesn't kind of justify me saying, can you guys just come over to my house and let's just talk all the time? What are you doing that makes sense, and where does it come from? That's separate from these problems that we both agree on.
This is what our story tells us we are. And this should sound quite Jewish, I think. And that is, the world was good, and then the world went bad. And the way that God
When was the
chooses
world
to-
good?
This is the mythological tale. But this is getting at truthfulness. And that would be different than, say, for instance, scientific or historical
Right.
accuracy.
Okay.
That's not the point.
Okay.
The truthfulness
We want to be clear.
in the mythological sense would be that the world made like God in an ecological harmony, for instance, then gets to be anything other than that. And once it does that, that if God was benevolent, there would be some mechanism of restoration. God's mechanism of restoration of the world is to actually, if you will, incarnate in a group of people. First the Jews, and then ultimately the Christians. And so God comes and dwells within a group of people so that the relationships they have between each other become exemplary.
Where's this good thing you're supposed to be telling? Because that's been the history of war.